Hello and welcome to this Blender tutorial on creating this fantasy sword from the Lord of the Rings. This is the sword that Gandalf carries, named Glamdring. This is the way it is portrayed in the films, and I think it looks pretty cool. The first few minutes of this does cover how to download references and setting them up in Blender. I know that's extremely basic, so you can skip this by clicking on the chapters below. On the same note, this tutorial is aimed toward the beginner. However, I do not voice every key I am tapping along the way or explain every term. I have made 2 videos on the subject of Blender's interface, and all of the tools covered in this video, those are linked in the description below. Alright, that's enough chit chat. Open up Blender and let's get started. Let's start by going to DuckDuckGo, type in Glamdring, and select Images. And then we'll select Wallpaper as the size of our images so that we get something really big. Pick something we like. View the image, make sure it's sufficiently detailed, right click on it, and click Save. Back in Blender, let's switch to front view, add a reference image, browse to the location where we saved our image, click it, and load reference image. Next, we'll need to set the scale of our image, so let's add a cube, and set the height on the z-axis to 1.2 meters. Select the image, and we want it to display only in the front of everything and turn on opacity down to 0.2 or something like that. Next, we can select the image and scale it down to where the pommel and the tip of the blade match up with the top and bottom of our cube. Then select the cube and hit delete. We're going to start with the guard and handle, so let's start by creating a cylinder. So Shift A and create a circle, actually. And here you'll see your options for what you just created, or you can hit F9 and it'll show up where your cursor is. We're going to go with 24 vertices, and 1 meter is way too big, 0.01 perhaps. It's too small, but that's fine. We'll move it up to about there. Now, when you tab into edit mode, we can scale it up to about there. E to extrude down, and scale that out here. Now, if we go into top view, we'll want to scale that bottom portion on the y-axis because it's more of an oval shape toward the bottom. If you're wondering how I'm getting this pie menu, there is a pie menus add-on for Blender that's included that you can turn on by going to Edit, Preferences, Add-ons, Pie, and then you can turn that on. And the default to bring that up is Alt-Q once you have that enabled. If you don't want to use that, you can use the number pad for your various views, which is the default way of doing it in Blender. You'll see that all of my keystrokes and mouse clicks and scrolls are listed on the bottom left of the screen as well, so that you can see how I'm doing everything. Alright, for right now we're going to leave this part unfinished as it is, and then it'll require this guard in order to complete the process. So let's add another object, and we'll go to plane, and we're going to have it face our view rather than the world coordinates, and scale it down. This is going to be the start of our guard. Let's split it down the middle. Control R gives you an edge loop. Delete the vertices on one side, and we're going to add a mirror modifier. Move it up on the Z somewhere around here, and tab into edit mode. And we're going to start by creating this kind of central triangular shape. merge those together. And you'll see our photo reference is not exact to what we are making. That's fine. Just estimate. So we'll make this sloping piece up here. Follow this ridge. And since this is, let's get rid of that. And we're going to go to the knife tool. Since this is a triangle, you can't just put loop cuts across it. Alright, we've got our kind of center shape. We want to keep this line across here because that's going to be, you'll notice there's a flat spot on here that we want to keep that shape there. It doesn't all just dip into the middle. So you'll see that when we scale this out, they kind of intersect in the middle of the screen. We don't want to do that. So there is an option on the mirror modifier called clipping that does not allow anything to cross your mirror line. And that's still not what we want. We'll only scale on the z-axis. And that'll get us kind of a starting point of what we can do here. So this is already at the bottom. We'll move things around to get our piece around the edge. And we do have, I made a mistake here of getting overlapping geometry. So let's go up here. Once I get a border piece here, we're gonna fix that. You'll see there's pieces moving around that really shouldn't be there. And now this area is going to be hidden by this handle attachment, so we don't have to worry about the shape too much up there. But let's select everything, and we want to merge by distance. And I've actually added that to the Q menu because I use it so often. And we'll see that now these vertices that were on top of each other are single vertices, vertexes, whatever you want to call them. Now, this guy we're going to get rid of and extrude up there. Now we do have a triangle left in the center. That's easily solved by cutting across here, and now you have a quad. It is always good to keep quad geometry because when you use modifiers on it that deform it, triangles cannot be deformed very well. Now since we have our mirror modifier on only on the x-axis, we will be adding a y-axis mirror but not quite yet because we need to be able to move some things. So let's take these faces and let's go into side view to our right or left, and we'll move them out on the Y past the edge of the handle attachment here. And that is not exactly what we wanted. Once you have these selected, go back into edge select mode and we'll grab all of that. Now when we move it on the Y, that entire center has now come out with it. Now what we want to do, it's probably easier to see if we get rid of the reference image at the moment, so let's hide it. We have a center that needs to dip in. And just taking this center line will probably be too extreme of a movement in there, so let's actually get rid of that. And take all of these faces, inset them a little bit. Take these, merge at center. Now we have this area here that we can divide up accordingly. So now we have a quad here. And we're going to keep that triangle. Now you'll see when I inset we ran into a problem here. If I were to hit B during the inset, it would ignore the border in the center. However, since we have our mirror turned on, we can get rid of that with clipping, and then just move these on the x-axis to the middle. There we go. Now it continues straight through. And we can take these faces, like we were about to do, move them in on the Y. Now you may think that doesn't look very detailed. You're right. We are keeping this very low poly at the moment. Let's turn on Y on our guard, and you'll see that it actually mirrored on the x-axis, on the z-axis. That is because we did not apply our rotation when we created it. When we created it as a plane, it was facing the view, not the world coordinates. So Control A will bring up the Apply menu. Rotation and Scale will fix that. So we're going to do a little bit with modifiers on this piece before we move on much further. So let's go back to the Item tab on the Tool menu. N hides and reveals that. And we will mark every edge that we want to be sharp. So we'll take these, not this inner area because that is smoothed out. Okay, so these we want to turn our bevel weight to 1. And in our modifier panel, again, we want to add a bevel. And by default, it takes a certain angle and bevels everything that's less than that. Change it to weight so that it's using the sides we marked. We want our bevel segment to have 2 segments in it, so you'll see every bevel is 2. You could add more, but it's really more detail than you need. We want to bring this down to something like 0.0005 or even smaller. Play with it till you have something you like that works. And actually, once we add a subdivision surface modifier, that might be too much. So let's do that. Let's add our subdivision surface. Give it 2 levels of subdivision. And let's give it a shade smooth so that we have an idea of what we're actually making. All right, let's move on to back to the handle connection. We're going to give this a shrink wrap modifier so that this edge matches this surface down here. However, if we just add a shrink wrap modifier, it's going to flatten the whole model against it. I'll give you an example. Add a shrink wrap. And if we make the target our guard, it just flattens out against it. So there are a few things we want to change. We want project to be the wrap method, and we want it to go in the negative and positive directions, and only on the z-axis. But again, it's flattened out. So how do we fix that? Well, select this bottom ring and go down here to Object Data. We're going to add a vertex group. You can name it whatever you want. I'm going to call it shrink because that's what it applies to. And while these are selected, hit Assign. Now, if we go back to our Modifier tab, on the shrink wrap modifier, you can select a vertex group at the bottom. Select the one you just created. Now you can see that the shrink wrap is only affecting that bottom ring. Now we're going to be hiding our reference and bringing it back quite a bit. So let's create a new collection. I'll call this one Working. And give us a new one called Reference. I'm going to move this down to the reference collection so that we can easily turn it on and off. Let's take this, and we're going to give this another modifier, and this is going to be the solidify modifier. Like that. And we don't need this inner geometry because you're not going to see it at all. So give it even thickness. I don't know why that's not the default. And we're going to change it to only rim. So now we have a rim at the top and bottom with no geometry on the inside. That's just going to not be useful. Now, we do need to apply these in order to get proper smoothing on here. So let's change this to shade smooth. And I'm going to add a subdivision surface modifier. Control 2 is a shortcut to do that. You could click here like we did the first time, subdivision surface, or Control 2 will add it with 2 levels of subdivision. Control 1 will give you a subdivision surface modifier with 1 level. So you use it a lot, so there's a shortcut for it. Now it's just all kind of not very good. So we need a bevel before our subdivision so that it knows to tighten up those edges. But even now it's not doing much for us. You can play with the angle until you get something that kind of is okay, but again, it's not going to work out too well. Actually, this may be working out for you. In some of my tests ahead of time, it did not work out well. So we're going to leave it there, because why do more work if you don't have to? If you find that these edges, no matter what you do with this angle, just are not getting sharp at the right places, what you can do is apply all the first 2 modifiers and mark the edges that you want modified, beveled. So you'll notice these are kind of sharp still. We don't really want that, so let's bring that up. And we want it to come up to just where it curves. There we go. That looks pretty good. So now we can leave that there. There's some overlapping stuff in here, but you're not going to see that in the model once you have the handle and everything on there. And I had been saying before that perhaps this bevel was too sharp. I think that is the case. I had in my mind that 005 would do it. I think that does look a little better. Yep. So you can tweak this until it looks perfect, but I think we will leave it pretty close to where it is. That looks pretty good in my opinion. Now we can move on to the next part of the sword. That next part is going to be our handle and the pommel as well. So let's turn on our reference layer again, or our collection rather. Go into front view, and we can see what we have so far. We don't have a whole lot of our sword after spending quite a bit of time, but this will start to move a little faster, especially once we get to the blade. So let's select this kind of attaching piece here for the handle, go into edit mode, and select the top ring. Hit Shift S to bring up the cursor menu, and we're going to move the cursor to the selected area. So right there, we wouldn't have had to go on into edit mode since that is the origin of that piece as well, so you could have just hit the piece and put the cursor there. Anyway, we have it. So let's go back into front view, and it's going to be very important to keep our cursor here and the origin of the handle piece here. So let's select, Shift A to add, and we're going to add a circle. And we want that circle to face the view rather than the world. And we don't need all of that geometry in there. We're going to make this 12. And do not move the object. Tab into edit mode and select any of the elements, which would be edges or vertices at this moment, and use G to move them up to where the top and bottom most vertices are lining up with these ridges. So let's scale that in a little bit, move that up. That looks pretty good. Let's delete the left half of these, and selecting the top and bottom vertices, we're going to move our cursor over here. Cursor to selected. Take all of this and move our point of reference to cursor, or change it to cursor, and scale on the X. Bring that in, and this is going to be kind of the profile of our grip pieces. Take these top and bottom again, extrude, and scale on the Z. There we go. And before we forget, let's change this back to median point because we'll get weird results if we don't. Now, making sure that the origin is still here in the center, the Z position doesn't matter so much, but the X and Y need to both be 0. On the modifier panel, we will add a screw modifier. And you'll see that that makes just a big ring. First thing we want to do is Control A and apply our rotation and scale. So now Z is the default axis on which the modifier acts. We want to move our screw amount up to where the top and bottom meet. The easiest way to get this exact is to take the dimensions of the object without the screw modifier on. Take the Z, copy that, and when we go back here, put that same number in here into the screw amount, and then your top and bottom will match. We want merge to be on, and we want that to be a pretty small number. This is the distance between any vertices that will be merged in our modifier. So let's change our iterations to something that's closer to the handle size. We want it to extend past the top and bottom. So let's just move it down. Like I said, the Z position doesn't matter so much. It is the X and Y that we are concerned with. If we were to move this, move it around, our screw modifier would not work correctly. So I guess I don't need all of that. That looks pretty good. Now, it is wider at the bottom than the top in our reference. So an easy modifier to add to that is the simple deform. And simple deform can do a few things: twist, bend, taper, stretch. We want to taper, and we want to taper on the Z-axis. And that's starting to look like what we need, except it's the wrong direction. Change the factor down to a negative. And that looks pretty good, I think. Now, these screw modifiers give you kind of this spiral geometry in here that is tough to put a straight cut across, and you'll notice that we need to bring that down a little bit yet, so that we're inside of our bottom piece here. And we'll add another iteration to 11. It goes to 11. And we might need to change our simple deform a little bit. That actually looks pretty good. Now, in order to get those flat cuts on top and bottom, we'll just use a Boolean modifier. We're going to use it twice. So let's put our cursor back to the middle. Shift S, cursor to world origin. Actually, it doesn't really matter. I'm just bringing our cursor up here so that it's kind of in the same area we're working in. Shift A, and we're going to add a cube. And scale that way down to something like that. Control A, rotation and scale. Now, move this on the Z to a place where the top edge kind of lines up roughly with the top of that little metal piece right there. And we're going to go into edit mode, copy or duplicate all of the geometry with Shift D, move it up on the Z, and we're going to do the same at the pommel. So bring that down to about there. Now this will serve as our Boolean operator. So let's select our handle once again, our grip, and let's collapse these. Add a Boolean modifier. And difference is already selected. That is the type of Boolean operation we want to do. Let's bring these guys up to working and hide reference. Now, we want to kind of chop off the top and bottom of our handle. You'll see it extends past where we need it to actually go. So, with this selected and our Boolean modifier added on difference, get this eyedropper, select our cube, and you'll see that it has removed the top and bottom. Now, we have some geometry here that got added. If you look, you've got these two lines that go out to these corners. You can fix that by moving the modifier object ever so much, like just a little bit. So we'll move that up on the Z a tiny bit. And the way you move just a little bit is by holding Shift while moving. Now, if we go back to solid view, we still see these. So what we can do for this object is go into the object properties, go to viewport display, and display as wire. Now it's not blocking our view, but we know it's there. But what we're going to do is we're going to get this out of our view entirely by moving it to a new collection. I hit M, and that brought up this menu. Hit new collection, and we're going to just call it booleans and hide it. Or not just hide it, we're going to turn it off. That's what this checkbox does. The I over here would hide, but it's only hiding it in the view. This would hide it from the render. Turning it off does both, essentially. So now we have our grip, and we can move on to our pommel. So let's bring our reference back. And you know what? There is something we need to change. This grip, I don't know if you can see it in the reference or not, is not actually a circle. It is an octagon. So what we can do is go back to our screw modifier, and we're going to change our steps to 8 for both viewport and render. And you'll see that changed something with our Boolean operation. Let's bring Booleans back. Select our cube and just move this top portion down a little to where it disappears. There we go. Hide our cube again. Now it looks alright. And everything we have in this scene, since it's not a low poly model in the end, we're going to add a subdivision surface again to get everything smooth looking. But now that's gotten rid of our octagon look. So we need a bevel modifier before the subdivision surface. And we don't want all of that to be so sharp. We'll bring this down, or up rather, and we want to turn off clamp overlap, and we want to bring this way down. You'll see there's some weird effects going on. 0.001 might be good for that. It does look alright. Let's bring our angle up. And this is something you just need to play with until it works. Alright, that was not working, so we're going to do this a little less of a procedural way. We're going to apply our screw modifier. So now when you go into edit mode, you'll see that all that geometry is there. It's not just the modifier anymore. So simple deform will also be applied, because we don't need to worry about going back to a straight cylinder anymore. And booleans, we don't want to apply those, however they are at the top. What we can do is move those down, and it should still work. It does not. Let's turn off our subdivision for the time being, and we're going to add we're going to change our bevel type to weight. And now when we go here, let's go into edge selection mode. Let's select all of our vertical pieces here. Now you'll notice that our merge option on our screw modifier didn't actually work correctly. So let's select all vertices, and in your search you can bring up merge by distance. Now everything is merged. That was probably our problem when we were trying to use the angle-based bevel. So now that we have all these selected, you can either bevel them with Control B or use a modifier, which I like to use a modifier because it's always reversible. So let's see what that looks like. That actually looks alright. Once we turn our subdivision back on, we may run into our Boolean problem though, which we can move the Boolean to the top again. Now that we have the order of our booleans and all our modifiers worked out, we can turn off bevel and subdivision so we can see exactly what's going on. With the boolean modifier, we want to hit apply because this gave us some geometry that isn't going to look very good with any kind of smoothing. So you can see it gave us all of this weird stuff here, and we're not going to see the top or bottom, but we will see the edge, and that does not look very good at all. So now that we applied our booleans, we can actually delete the boolean operator, and let's go into edit mode and hit slash on the numpad, and now you can see just this object. It's local view. Select the top and bottom faces and delete them. With that geometry gone, we no longer have our weird shading around the top and bottom. So if we hit slash on the numpad again, that'll take us out of local view, and we can start on our pommel. So let's go into front view again, and we'll move our cursor up to somewhere in that region. And that was pretty good right there. Anyway, we'll add another 8-sided circle, and we'll keep it aligned with the world rather than the view. We'll scale it out somewhere around here. It's going to be larger than the leather grip. Control A for applying rotation and scale, since we just scaled that outside of edit mode. So front view again, move it up to about there, and we can start extruding. So in edit mode, select all the edges or vertices, extrude them on the Z, and the whole thing has to be scaled a little bit. There we go. We will extrude this on the Z, bring it in a little bit, and extrude again on the same axis. Let's put some edge loops in here that we can use to manipulate the curve of the stem. We'll bring this edge loop up again on the Z. And scale that out to this kind of this line across here. Now, in order to use a particular function, which is called skew, we're going to need to eliminate half of this. So let's take out the left-hand side, and let's grab the top, what's left of the ring here, that'd be half of it. Go to front view, and make sure you're on front view, not a custom angle or anything. And Shift Control Alt S brings up skew, and hit Y for the Y-axis. That is the Y-axis in relation to your screen, not the world. And let's bring that down here. You could rotate as well, and then you'd have to scale things again. Skew keeps things on their correct X location when we do that. So now we can add a mirror modifier, and in fact, let's take out the back side of this as well. So now only a quarter of our circle remains. So we can turn on X and Y for our mirror modifier. And we're going to add one more loop cut on each of these faces. So now we have geometry here that we can edge slide to get to the tops of our arcs here. If you double tap G, it will edge slide. Hitting C will let you extend off the end of the edge that it's sliding on. Now we can extrude this top portion again, scale to 0 on the Z, and now since we're going to be dealing with a circle again, we don't want the mirror modifier because it just makes things more complicated. So in object mode, apply the mirror because we no longer need to make any complicated functions. So we're going to scale that in a little bit. Scale that in and do 2 more edge loops to scale out here. There we go. And then on the top, I think we're close enough to the top to just do a Control F for faces and G for grid fill. And we can change how many segments are in that grid. That might be okay. So let's grab the 4 quads in the center of that. And move those up. And now just that center vertex. So now that may be enough geometry for the center. We may have to add a little. So let's try adding a bevel modifier, and we're going to go into local view so that reference is not getting in the way. Turn our bevel modifier to 2 segments and bring it down to 0.0005. And change that to weight. And we'll have to mark the weight of each that needs to be beveled. So all of these edges that need to be sharp need to be selected. Turn the mean bevel weight up to 1. And now we can add our subdivision surface modifier, and that should look pretty good. So change it to shade smooth. And if the top of this is looking lumpy, we can take these guys, these 4 vertices, and scale them into the center a little bit more. So just adjust the position of these vertices. You just don't want any too close together. Since we added some of that geometry in between on those faces, these are not perfect circle rings. So if you have not enabled loop tools, you'll want to do that. Go to Edit, Preferences, Add-ons, Loop Tools, and that will give you some more tools in dealing with circles in this case. So let's select this ring, right click, and Loop Tools is at the top of the right click menu. Hit Circle, and just do that for each of these. That looks all right. You can play with that a lot more to get things much more smooth. You would have to add some more geometry to do so. I think this is pretty good where it is. We might want to affect this curve a little more with, you can see that there's an edge here that the subdivision surface is kind of masking. Let's add one in between here and scale that a little bit. That's more of a curve than a sharp edge, sharp bend then. So if we go out of local view, let's turn off the reference, bring our circle up into working, and we might want to name some of these. So hit F2. Alright, so now we are ready to add the final part of the modeling, and that will be the blade. But before we move on, I realized there were two areas that we missed with the pommel. One is our curve needs a little bit more geometry, so we'll scale that in. Okay, maybe that's three things here. So we'll select all of these areas that are the inner part of these curved recesses. Scale those on all axes but Z, so that would be S for scale and Shift Z to exclude Z. Bring those in. That looks a lot better. And then the bottom portion needs a bit of a bevel as well. So if we select the bottom ring that is, E, Z, scale in a little bit, and then we will select all our corners again that need to be beveled and mark them. Now we can call that done and move on to the blade. In order to create the blade, we're going to turn our reference images back on, and we're going to create a new object, and we're going to start with a plane, and we're going to have it face our view and scale it down quite a bit. Alright, so we'll move that down here. I'm not sure what I did to disable the collection with our reference on it, but it's back now. And I'm going to scale this down to the size of the fuller on the blade. Now, this is another section where our reference image is not exactly lining up. What we can do is, it's usually not a good idea to move your images after the fact, after you've started modeling some parts of the model and not others, but we're going to go against the rules and do that anyway. We'll move this over on the X so that the center of that blade is on the 0 mark, and you'll see that the point of the blade isn't completely there like the top, so our image is not exactly straight, but we can jimmy it a little to kind of match up with what we need. So let's scale this on the Z. Now we'll start adding some loop cuts, because that is what we need in order to start making these curves. Scale that in. I'm going to merge these. Alright, now there are portions of this blade, you'll notice this section is wider than up here, so it kind of dips in the middle. The fuller does not seem to actually do that. It seems to be just the outer part of the blade. So what we'll do is go to wireframe here, and let's take the top of this all the way up to somewhere inside the handle, and let's add a loop cut here where we see this line kind of curve off, and we'll extrude this out to maybe here. Let's give this an even number, and this is going to merge at that point. And what we can do is start bringing these into the we want this edge, not the outer edge yet. I'm trying to keep all quad geometry here. We don't need that top. So let's go back into solid view, and you can see what that is doing. It's all on the same plane right now, so we're not going to see any real shading. But now, if we take this edge that goes the entire way down, we can extrude this on the X. What we'll do is start moving these to where they match up with the sharp portion of the blade. This really is the simplest part of the model that we're working on. However, it does have to look right, otherwise your whole sword will look kind of bad, because it's kind of the primary part of the sword. This portion down here can be a little tricky. Just bring this down to the tip of the sword. Give it a few more loop cuts. It does need more than what the top portion of the sword does, because this has to curve just right. I'm trying to space these evenly. I don't know that I'm getting the angles I want on them by doing that. In fact, let's just get rid of this, and that might work a little better. Loop tools will help us again here with the G stretch option. Alright, now that we have the shape that we want here, what I'm going to do is split this down the center and select all of these that are left of the line, which will be our mirror line. And for now, let's put a cut there by hitting join, J for join. And let's add a mirror. And we're only adding a mirror on the X for the time being. And we want to clip and merge. Let's give that a larger margin, or smaller margin. They have to be very close in order to merge. Alright, let's hide our reference. Let's rename this blade and bring it up to working. Maybe we should rename working to sword. Or better yet, we can name it Glamdring. Alright. Now, let's select the entire fuller. I'm not sure what's going on here, why something is not connected. And it looks like we have some, there we go. We have a face that's overlapping another face. Delete it. Take these three edges and hit fill. Now, there. Now our selection works correctly. So take the entire fuller and let's go into side view to the right. And we're going to move it on the Y out a little ways, not too much, because our blade shouldn't be extremely thick. Now, we forgot something when we selected there. Let's take these as well. I did get everything. Alright. So now, let's go into right hand or left hand view, move on the Y to somewhere that makes sense. Now we can turn on the Y axis on our mirroring. So once again, when you see something mirroring in the wrong direction, or the direction you don't think that you were not expecting, apply the rotation and scale. So there we go. Now the fuller should dip in the middle, but first let's fix this flat portion of the blade. So turn off the mirror while we do this. And we're going to take these and move them on the Y. Now if we go into side view, we can move these to where they make a good slope downward. Turn our mirror back on. Now let's turn on smoothing. Some of this is going to have to be fixed down here. Actually, let's go back to flat. Once we have our mirror modifier turned on, we can better work with this. But right now, let's make the fuller dip in the middle. So we go all the way to the top. And just move that in on the Y to a point where it doesn't meet the other one coming in from the other side. Right there is probably good. And let's move this up a little ways. Okay, now let's do our usual routine of selecting our edges to be beveled. We do need the top of our blade to extend a little further than it is, so we will extrude that on the Z and scale it on the X and continue with our bevel markings. So I had clipping turned on and that messed something up for me here. When I scaled on the X, these scaled into each other and stopped there. So what I'm going to do to fix that is go into front view. I'm going to go into K for knife and hit A to constrain that to an angle. Those are 45-degree angles it will constrain to. And I'm going to delete these faces. And fill that. There's a dozen ways to do this, but I'm going to subdivide this, turn on snapping, G on the X, and G on the Y, and on the Z, so that it lines up. Let's mark this for a bevel. Alright, now with that little repair out of the way, we can turn on our shade smooth and add a subdivision surface. Now, right here it looks like we have normals that are not all facing the same direction. The way you can test for that, let's turn these off. And when you see weird shading like that, it's faces that are not all facing the same way. So up here on overlays, we can turn on face orientation. Blue is the outer side of a face, red is the back side. They should all be facing the same way. To do so, if they're not, select all faces and hit Shift N, and that will recalculate normals. So now it looks alright. Let's turn that blue off, turn on our mirror and our subdivision, and we are still lacking our bevel modifier. So let's add it. And bevel always has to be before the subdivision. And we're going to change this to weight because we marked exactly what we wanted to have sharp edges. And this is going to be extremely small to that point. Now, this looks pretty good all around except for one glaring problem. This should be pointy. So what we're going to do here is we're going to do a manual bevel and give it 2 segments and have them pretty close together like that. Make sure that our bevel modifier markings continue through here. And we're going to add, or rather, we'll take this, Move this up here. And this might take some toying around to try and get exactly right, because what we're trying to avoid is we want this to be sharp, but we don't want a crease mark going all the way over here, and we don't want things like this. So the way we're going to do this is we're probably going to include a triangle here. Loop Tools has another handy option here called G-stretch. These will all be the same distance once you do that. And then there is also space, which in this case should space them all along the curve we have. It's looking all right, except for this section. So we may it may look all right without adding anything. Yeah, let's give it some geometry here. And did that extend around here? No, it did not. However, that fixes the problem of having triangles there. Let's move this back on the Y. That's looking all right. There's a bit of a crease here, but it's not too egregious. And once we have our materials on, it's not going to look too bad. So let's fix the curve on the tip. That looks pretty good. Feel free to keep working with it until it gets just the shape you want. But that is the end of the modeling portion for our sword. With the exception of one thing, our guard never got closed ends. So let's go here and select these edges, mark them as needing to bevel, fill them in, and that still doesn't look right, so let's right click and go to Loop Tools and flatten. And that still doesn't look right. So what we're going to have to do is just take our centerpiece, go to front view here, and just move it out. And it can extend a little further than the points on the edges. And that looks pretty good. So from here, we can move on to making the materials. So we'll have two different metal materials and a leather material. Leather for the grip, the rest is, of course, metal. The blade usually has a little bit of a different look from the rest of the metal, and that is what we'll attempt to achieve. Before we jump into material creation, you'll want to go to Preferences, Add-ons, and make sure you have the Node Wrangler enabled. That is Node Wrangler add-on. And this will give us a bunch of shortcuts when we are creating materials with nodes that just save us some time. So with that, let's grab a corner, bring it up, and open up our shader editor. To start with, we're going to do the easiest material first, and that will be the leather material. Let's change this to material preview, so that's Z and 2 or down, and we'll hit new. This gives us a principled BSDF and nothing else. So we want to just add a a PBR texture set to this, but before we do that, we need to go find one and download it. So the best place to do that is 3dassets.1. Once you're on 3dassets.1, simply search for leather and find something that has a good texture to it for what we'll be doing. One of my favorite sources on here is Ambient CG. I happen to know this is by Ambient CG. You can see that in the bottom right hand corner when you mouse over it. We'll select it, select JPEG, and download. You will need to unzip the zip file in order for Blender to be able to import the textures that are in the archive file. So go ahead and do that and then hop back into Blender. Once you're back in Blender, make sure the principled BSDF is selected, and if you enabled the Node Wrangler, the shortcut Control-Shift-T will bring up a browser window for file browsers, and you can go to wherever you just downloaded that leather texture, open it up, and let's select the normal GL, not the DirectX normal. There is a difference. Roughness and displacement. Once you've selected the three you need, click the principled texture set and they'll be imported. Now, some of this is not quite the way we want it because we're not going to be using displacement. So let's get rid of displacement and replace that with a bump node. So Shift A, just like in the 3D viewport, brings up the add menu, and we're going to look for a bump. Put that right in front of the normal map. Plug this into height. And now you'll see we have this weird texture that doesn't look right at all. That is because we did not UV unwrap. However, we're not going to unwrap our UVs. We're going to use our object coordinates and change all of our textures from flat to box with a blend of 0.1. Let's make sure that UV has not been plugged in here at all and take object up to vector. Now we see our leather texture is on the handle, however it's far too big. So let's we can change the scale, but rather than changing X and Y separately, let's add a value node. Plug that in here, and let's make it a 0.1. Sorry, that's the wrong direction. 4. Maybe smaller. 6 times? That might look pretty good. And now we did not download the albedo, diffuse, or any kind of color map. So what we can do is change the base color on its own and bring it to something that matches our reference image. And that looks all right. I think our bump is too extreme. Let's bring that down to say 0.1 or 2. I think that looks much better. So we've got a nice looking handle there. The leather could be a little darker. When we get to actual lighting, we'll be able to see better what it is we're doing. But that is really the material creation process for the leather, and now we can move on to one of the metal materials. For our metal material, we're going to go back to 3dassets.1, and we're going to select Ambient CG as our source, and look for metal. We're going to scroll down until we find this one, which is Metal 03. Download the 2K JPEGs and save them. Back in Blender, we're going to select one of our pieces, like this, and hit New. And you can name that if you like, right up here. We're going to Control-Shift-T after selecting Principled BSDF and go to where we saved our metal material. Once you've found where you saved your metal, in this case it's metal 03, we'll take the normal, the roughness, and the color and import them. Now we did not UV unwrap, so again we must go through object. Object is going to be the texture coordinate type, and we'll change these to box with a 0.1 blend. And like our other texture, we're going to add a value, and we'll make that detail smaller by making the texture larger. Looks like 6 once again is the size we're going for, maybe 8. And this material must be set to metallic. And I don't know why that connected there, but this is a roughness map and it imported twice. So we'll get rid of that one and turn up metallic to 1. So there we have that, but that's a little plain. We want to have some striation in it, like stainless steel would have. So let's go up here, and we're going to make add a few nodes to make a procedural striping or striation, whatever you want to call it. So we'll start with a noise texture, and that is a noise texture, not a white noise. We're going to select it and hit Control T to add our mapping and texture coordinate to it, make it object, and Control Shift click will show us what this is looking like right now. So right now it doesn't look like much. Let's change the scale of this to something extremely high, like 4,000. And so there's our noise. It's looking like you can actually see what it is now. Let's take our all these other values we can actually leave the same. What we're going to do is stretch this in 2 directions. So on the X and the Y, we're going to make it 0.03. I don't know what happened there, but we'll say 0.03 again. 0.03. Now we've got this kind of striping going on around it. And we're going to add a color ramp. If you've never worked with nodes before, I'm not going into great detail here. Just follow along for the time being. This will control the difference between the light and dark portions of our material, and we can change how dark or light each part of that is. And let's we don't want them to be extremes at the moment. That is fairly extreme, but let's try that out. We're going to mix that with our roughness, our pre-existing roughness. To do that, we're going to need an RGB mix node. Mix RGB, sorry. And we'll put that there. Let's plug the roughness map into the lower socket and this into the upper socket and change our mix type to screen. Now you'll see we've got a more, I like the look better. So let's also add a brightness and contrast node right here. The brighter it is, the rougher it will look. The darker it is, the shinier it will look. So that looks good. The pommel should have the same exact thing, so we'll select it and then select our handle connector ring again and say Control L to link object data, but we're not going with object data, we're going with materials. And there we have the same thing in both cases. Now this will also have a similar material. So we're going to copy that over. Now that that is copied over, both of these materials, actually all three of these objects rather, are sharing the same material. We want this one to be slightly different. We want the striations to go the opposite direction, up and down. So to do that, you see this number in the material editor here. That tells you how many objects are using this material. If you click it, this object now has its own material that's just exactly the same. But now we can edit this without changing the other objects. So let's change the direction by changing the scale. Now we have it going that way. I think that looks better. If you don't think so, don't do that. Now our blade is going to share materials with one of these, and we have to see which one do we want it to have. I think the striations should go that direction. There's one way to find out, and that is to look at your reference material. And yes, I'm looking at it off screen, and that is correct. So let's go here, and I'm sorry, that is not correct. We want it to share this one. There we go. And that is, the stripes are going the way we want. Now, that looks a little plain, and in our reference image, if we go back to that and only show the reference image, the blade is a lot less glossy than the rest of it, the rest of the sword. So what we want to do is, overall, we want the roughness map to be darker, brighter, I'm sorry, but we may want to add a little bit of other texture to it. So let's turn that layer off and select the blade, make this unique, and I think we want some blotchiness to the blade to make it look maybe a little dirty or something like that. So let's take these guys, put them up here. What we can do is add a frame, and when we drag these in, they've got their own frame. Now, a good way to add some kind of smudginess or grunginess to something is to add a Musgrave texture. So let's bring this up here and add a Musgrave. Now what we can do to isolate this is Control-Shift-Click, and it displays exactly what that Musgrave texture is doing at the moment. It's not very useful looking like that. So let's change the scale to something like 20. Change the detail up, I don't know, around 15 or all the way up at 16. I thought 16 was the high, but maybe 15 is. And let's turn the dimension way down, maybe 0.2 or 3. And it's just stretched out all over the place. So what we want to do is add a mapping node to this. So let's not copy this one. Let's add another one. You'll see this is a little taller than the other one. Doesn't matter. It is the same thing. You can stretch it if you want. And let's use object coordinates for this one as well. So we'll take that from there, plug in here. Now we have a better look or a better look at what we're doing. So we want to, let's take these and put them above this. It might make more sense the way we're plugging them into mix nodes. So let's take a color ramp. Let's just copy this one. No, let's not do that. Let's add a new one so that we're starting fresh. Now, we want this to be kind of a rougher look on top of everything, so we don't want the dark colors. And we're going to take a mix RGB, And actually, the way we're doing this, it's going to be on the bottom. It doesn't really matter. It's just when we have these squigglies going all over the place, we don't want them crossing so much so that we can tell what's going on. So mix RGB, put that here, put this here, and Control Shift click here, and we're going to change this to multiply. If you're wondering what all these are, if you're used to Photoshop at all or anything like that, these are like the blend methods between layers. That's exactly what's going on here. Alright, so let's bring the factor over this way a little more. Here we go. We have kind of a dirty look to it. And let's Control Shift click on our principled BSDF. And that, I think, looks a little better. You might want to add that to your other materials as well. But we're going to make this a little rougher to kind of match our reference image. Now, this is all just this is rendered in Eevee. It's the real-time kind of approximation render engine. What we can do is add some lighting and show this in the actual Cycles render engine. So let's hold Z and go to rendered, or click rendered up here on the top. And right now we just have this even gray light that's not doing much for us. We can change over here in the World tab, click on color, and we're going to change that to environment texture. And we want an HDRI. It's trying to find an HDRI file and it doesn't have one, so it's just showing up pink. The way we're going to get this is to go to polyhaven.com. Once you've got to Polyhaven, we will go to HDRIs. They have textures and models as well. And we want an indoor, and let's see. I like this Kaylee interior, so let's select that. And we only need the lighting from it, so we don't need this to be high detail or anything. So select 1K. It'll take up less memory in your render as well. And not EXR, we want HDRI or HDR. And then click download. Back in Blender, once you've completed your download and extraction, we'll go over here to open. And I have a place where I save all mine. Let's pick our Kaylee interior, and let's make things a little less harsh on the eyes with all this flashing going on. So let's, on the render tab, we're going to go down to film, change that to transparent. So now we have nothing around us. And hitting 5 on the numpad will switch from perspective or orthographic. I'm using the pie menu. So here is what our sword is looking like. I think it looks pretty good, but that might be a little too dull. So let's bring it back down. 0.2. It's probably where we had it. 0.15. That looks alright. Play with your values until it looks right. So what we can do is now go to front view, put our cursor right here on the blade, Shift A, and add a camera. Let's change that camera to a different aspect ratio. Let's say 1080 by 1350. That is a great resolution for Instagram and Facebook, by the way. So what we can do is hit 0 on the numpad, or view camera from the pie menu, and hit G, middle mouse button, and then move your mouse up and down. And that'll zoom in and out, or pan in and out, however that is said. And hit G to move it around. I'm going to move it on the Z. Frame it up in a way that looks good. And let's go to our render settings. So let's get out of render view here so we're not rendering two things at once. And let's get rid of this, because we're no longer doing that. We're no longer making materials, we have them. So go to your camera view again, that is 0 on the numpad, or the pie menu has it as well. So on the render tab, you want to change your max samples to something reasonable. That might be a little high, 4096, but I'm going to keep it that way. Turn off denoising. The best way to denoise is always in post. Down here on our output tab, this is where we set our resolution. You can make it bigger, smaller. We now have this set to do a transparent background. If your output file type is RGBA, it will keep that transparency. If it is anything else, it will not. So there is 16-bit color depth. We want that. We're going to go with an RGBA. If you're uploading somewhere where a file that says your file is too big, change that to JPEG, and you're going to have a black background rather than a transparent. And this looks pretty good. However, one last thing, back on the render tab, all the way at the bottom under color management, you'll want to change the look to medium high or high contrast. It will just look better. Now you can either hit the render button or hit F12, which is also render. And your render view up here will tell you how much time it took for that to render, how much memory it took. Now you can click Image and Save As, and pick a place to save it. We have one last physical detail to add, and that is the gem on the front. And it's just a little teardrop shape that we will put right here in this area. So let's go here, and let's make sure our 3D cursor is on center. It really just has to look good enough. It doesn't have to be centered, but I like having things perfect, so why not? Let's go to Mesh, add a circle, and we're going to keep it at 8 vertices, and View will be the orientation, the alignment, and we're going to scale it down. And let's go to wireframe because it's going to be partially obscured at the moment. So let's hit tab into edit mode, and let's turn on our proportional editing, and we'll turn it to sharp. Let's move this vertex up and scroll up until you can see the circle of the influence of proportional editing. That looks good. That is the shape of the gem that is on there. Let's select all the edges, extrude on the Y, extrude again and scale. Move that on the Y. Let's turn off proportional editing, we don't need it. And Control F, G. And we'll give it one more on the span. And give it an offset that moves it to a vertical. Now let's move this down and out. So if we look at a right-hand view, it looks like a good shape. Let's take all of this, E, scale in, and Control F, G. And it doesn't matter what the geometry on the back is like, it's all quads. So add a subdivision surface, and that should be fine. Let's go back to our front view and back to solid. Let's make this smooth and make it a little bigger, and rotate on the X, and that looks pretty good right there. Maybe we can move it by on its local z-axis by double tapping Z after G. That is probably good enough. For the material, let's just make a new one. Call it gem. This is like the principal BSDF node in the node editor. We're just going to give it a color, dark blue, and it should be completely smooth. So take the roughness to 0 and bring the transmission to 1. So if we go to rendered view, you'll see that it's just a smooth blue sapphire looking gem. Let's put one on either side. So let's give it a mirror, and with our mirror object we can take the eyedropper and just select any of the other objects, and it'll use those as the mirror. Y is how we want to do it. There we go. Now we have our gem on either side. I'm going to call that finished. There are runes on this sword. I'm going to do kind of a bonus chapter at the end, but that involves using a 2D program. I'm going to be using GIMP, and it's really not a Blender tutorial completely. It will involve using GIMP as well. So if you're interested in putting the runes on there, stay tuned. I'll go into that in the next little segment. However, for those of you who say this is good enough, I don't want to deal with GIMP, there you have it. It's good enough. Alright, it is time for our bonus round. If you've still hung around, that means you want to put those runes on our handle. So, the best way to do that, or the easiest way rather, because there are plenty of ways and I'm not sure what you would call the best, is to open a UV editor here, and let's go to our guard, and first, so the inscription on this side and this side are not the same. So first we're going to apply our mirror modifier, but only on the X, because we want the same to appear on both sides. Let's apply this. Now let's add a mirror modifier back on to the top of the stack that is just Y. Alright, that's fine. So let's go to front view, tab, and we are going to select only the faces where there's going to be runes inscribed in it. So let's select just those, hit U for unwrap, and we're going to project from view. There they are. And we are also going to take these in a separate action, and we're going to do the same. U, project from view. Now, over in the UV editor, let's turn on sync with selection, and we're going to select the things that we just unwrapped. Control L to get everything that is linked to them. Control I for everything else, and scale it down. The UV for that is not being used for anything else. Put it in a corner. We don't need it. So let's go into full screen with this. Control L to get this entire island without the others. Move it down a little bit. Alright, so these, we're going to make perfect rectangles out of these. So let's select a face. You don't even have to do that really. You just turn on snapping, turn on vertex. Take one of these vertices, and G will move it, and Y will constrain it, and when you go close to another vertex, it will snap on the Y to that vertex. I hope that makes sense. So we're doing that here, and this we're going to move on the X. Same with this one. Alright, now let's do the same over here. The reason we did that is because we're going to line these up in a straight line, and we're going to orient the others according to this perfect one. So let's go into face selection mode, Control L, and if this is your primary one, you'll see it's a different color. You can right click and say follow active quads, and now we have these lined up. We're going to do the same here. Now let's take this one and put this up top, and we'll turn off snapping. And what we'll do is make these large enough to just take up most of the space, or be as big as they can be within the space. Alright, now with everything selected, go to the UV menu and export UV layout. Make sure this is 2K or greater. 2048 is what I'm going to do. And a PNG with a transparent background, that's fine. Just call it guard UV or something to that effect. Alright, now that is the end of using Blender for this portion. Now we're moving on to GIMP. So if you do not currently have GIMP, go to gimp.org and download the latest version. It is a 2D image editor, and that is what we will use to put our runes in. Once you've opened GIMP, you can open up your guard UV image or drag it in. And I've also included a link to a file that is a normal that I've made of the inscriptions that go in these segments, into these sections. So you can also drag that in as well. Now you'll see that this is not the highest resolution in the world, so it may not look the greatest, but I was not able to find the runes in a higher resolution. If you find it, send me a link or put it in the comments or something, because that would be great. This may not look the best, but it'll give you an idea of how to add runes or any kind of inscription to a material. So let's take this layer and expand to the bounds of the image. So layer to image bounds, or layer to image size rather. Let's select this, Control X, Control V, and we're going to move that here into this section, and let's enlarge that layer. So we're going to scale layer, and let's try 300%. Looks about right. Now that blocky, blurry look, that will come across in the UVs on the final image, so it's not going to be super, but again, this is kind of giving you the technique with the best resources I was able to find in a short search. This top one goes on our left hand side, and that is the top one if you arranged it the same way I did. So we'll bring that up here and we will scale that layer. 200 probably will do it. 200%. Maybe not. Let's do 300%. In fact, yes. We're going to do 250. We want to anchor that pasted layer. GIMP has the wonderful interface of zooming, requires you to hold control while scrolling the scroll wheel. It's ridiculous, especially when you've been working in some other program and you're switching back and forth, and you want to zoom. It's really annoying. You just start scrolling all over the place. That'll fit. We'll see how that actually looks. Kind of center it anchor that as well. And then let's add another layer. And that is in between the two, that is on top of our back layer and below this one. So let's take the eyedropper on this layer and just get a sample of that purple. And go back to here. It's called planet. That's because the last thing I was working on, I think I called a layer planet. So there we go. That's good. We're going to export this. And let's overwrite runes underscore norm. Or create it if you haven't. And let's go back to Blender. Now that we're in Blender, we will close out that window, and we want to have our shader editor open. Select the hilt or the guard, and we're going to make sure that that material is only being used by that piece, and it is, because there is no number here displaying more than one. So let's drag our runes normal in here. Make sure that it is not set to use color or anything besides non-color. Alright, now just before the normal map, we're going to put a mix RGB. Switch this to overlay. Put that in there. And if we go down here, we may see something show up, but there is another step yet. Alright, it does show without any of the additional things I was going to add. Control T will give you that mapping node and UV coordinate. However, by default, I guess it's already using the UV system. So that is present, and I think we want to make it a little more extreme. So on the normal map node, click the strength and make it 2, perhaps. Something like that, maybe 3. Keep in mind this is going to make the entire normal map more extreme, not just the engraving. But anyway, there it is. That's part of your material now. If you were to try and apply the material on this to something else, these will kind of show up in odd places on whatever model you were to add it to. But that is that. You have the runes, you have the complete sword. It's time to make your final render and impress your friends. You can post this on social media and tag BlenderForge on Facebook or Instagram. I'd love to see what you do. But until next time, I'm Carl with BlenderForge. Happy blending!